Thanks for joining today. I'm really excited to be hosting the webinar today. I'm comparing three great panelists. We'll be talking about through the whole story around data and analytics. And clearly, the story around data analytics in HR has been a long and distinguished one. It is one where HR for a long time has been working to leverage the power of the technologies that have been implemented to really take that insight around people and use it to help inform strategic decisions in the business. And certainly over the last 18 months, the last year in particular with COVID, there has been, I think, a step change in the ability to use that data to help businesses. It's a necessity to make that happen. And we're going to reflect a little bit on some of that today. We're going to talk a little bit about the type of productivity challenges that people use analytics and data in HR for, and where that might be progressing over time. And we're going to talk and reflect a little bit on some lessons learned, I think, today, with some of that, where people can go wrong, where there's things to talk about. And certainly in prepping with the panelists for this conversation, I think we all felt that we could do a 3-hour webinar on this. So bear with us, we'll be fitting in quite a lot of content into the next 60 minutes. And certainly part of my job will be stopping us going down some rabbit holes and starting to get in all excited and geeky around the data as we start talking as well. I'm very excited, as I say, to be joined today by 3 panelists. The first of whom is Shelley Vakes, the Chief People Officer at Scott Dunn. Shelley, welcome. Good to see you there today. We'll do a little bit more of a detailed introduction in a minute and hear the story around Scott Dunn. We're very excited around that, and your journey with data. It's been fascinating in the prep for this, listening to that. So I'm very excited to share that with the audience, and your journey on data and your journey with Ceridian as the sort of provider that's provided a lot of that insight for you. I'm also joined by Steve van Veeren, who's the head of data analytics at Ceridian. Welcome, Steve. Great to see you there as well. And again, I think between the 3 of us, we're all going to geek out on data as we go through today and its power for HR and the difference it can make. And then last but not least, certainly not least, joined by Wendy Muirhead as well, VP for Ceridian in Europe. Welcome, Wendy. Great to see you again. Looking forward to the insights from various other customers and clients that you have and their journey and experience around data and analytics. So that said, I suggest we get underway, and Shelley, if it's okay, I would like to start with yourself and just really, if you can share maybe with the audience a little bit of that story around the Scott Dunn journey and the experience you've been through recently.
Sure, thank you, Aaron. As Aaron said, I'm Shelley Vakes. I'm the Chief People Officer for Scott Dunn. Scott Dunn is in the business of luxury travel, and we have the pleasure of creating bespoke, very high-end holidays for people. So it's quite a fun business to be in because we're creating memories for people, and it's normally a happy time for people to get away and escape. We're headquartered here in London, which is where I am today. We have offices in the US and Singapore. And as you can imagine, when the pandemic hit almost 18 months ago now, we could see it steadily advancing. First, it impacted our Asia business, then it started moving across to Europe, then to the UK, and ultimately to the US. And when it hit us very hard. We're a very people and service focused business. Our guests come to us because we've got the specialized knowledge and the expertise that comes from having traveled to just about everywhere in the world. And we had traditionally been an office-based, 5 days in the office, kind of a buzzy call center environment, lots of people in, lots of people sharing their knowledge of where they had traveled to. And when COVID hit, we immediately, like most companies, had to pivot to fully remote working. For us at the time, our priorities were our guests and our employees, but it was also, start energy saving ideas. The lights go out when you don't move around enough, so hopefully I'm not too in the dark. But really, one of our key priorities was also conserving cash because we were in survival mode. So there were two things we did. First, workforce planning came to the forefront, and HR's role in that was significant. We created a headcount model, which we used to forecast the resources and the skills that we needed, and the cash impact of that. And we input different projections about when we thought travel would bounce back and where in the world it would bounce back. And I don't think we had any clue at the time that we'd still be adjusting that same model today, 16 months on. And I think we're on version 25 of the model, if I'm correct, because travel continues to just bounce all over the place, and it's been quite a roller coaster. But we looked at things like furlough assumptions, and in the UK, the furlough scheme was a saving grace for us. But we also fed in temporary pay cuts, redundancy planning. We went person by person, geography by geography, and just pulled different levers so that we could keep up with the trends that we were seeing in the business in terms of what was happening with our bookings, what was happening with postponements and rearrangements. And so really, this data was crucial for us in terms of a business planning standpoint. Secondly, we started to look at our tools more closely, one of those being Dayforce, and in terms of how we could become more efficient. And I know I've shared this with Wendy, but when I first joined the company 2 years ago, Dayforce did not have the best reputation. And in fact, my team thought it was utterly useless and wanted to throw it out and start all over again. And instead of doing that, we decided to take a closer look at it. And, was it Dayforce or was it us? How were we using the tools, and were we using the tools to its full capabilities? And the answer was no. Equally, we weren't holding our managers accountable for using the tools, for owning processes end to end, for self-service and pulling the data that would help them make better decisions. And so once we started to really set some of those expectations about what it could be used for, what it should be used for. For example, how a manager could own the recruitment process end to end, using the reporting, using workflows, using letter management. So many things we weren't using before. And then on the back of that, we implemented the payroll module and did it in record time. And as a result, we've seen significant efficiencies in the processing for monthly payrolls. And so I guess what I would say to summarize is that COVID forced us to use Dayforce and our other tools and to look at the data in a different way and become more efficient. And where we sit today is light years of where we were pre-COVID.
Excellent. Thanks, Shelley. And a fascinating story. I know we're going to come on and talk about your passion around data, and certainly when we talk about lessons learned, how you looked at what you needed to do to get the most out of your tools, I think will be great for people to listen into as well. And as you say, light years away from where you were pre-COVID, and that ability to project in real time is quite important as well in terms of that link, isn't it? And we'll talk about productivity in a second and how to link that. But if you don't mind, I'm going to move on to Steve. And just, Steve, as someone who deals with data and analytics all the time as your profession, how has the last 18 months changed?
It's been amazing how fast everything had to suddenly change. We went from a world where roughly 5 to 10% of people were virtual workers to anywhere from 75 to 80% of people suddenly virtually working. So everything became digital very, very fast. The importance at that point of having different kind of measures in place to be able to measure the quality of an employee's work and even their experience in working just jumped off the charts. And so part of what we had to do even here at Ceridian was to improve our reporting and visualization tools as well, and trying to make it where presenting more things in visualization and visual forms was really an important priority for us. So it caused us to pivot on our side, for sure. But in general, you know, I have a theory that we should be measuring a million things and be sharing the top three with you know, with all HR leaders. There's no way that an HR leader has a time or attention span to be able to look at a million different reports. So the more I can help that activity and really help focus on these are the most important places for you to look at any given point in time, we'll really start to provide a little bit more information and guidance to be able to make smart recommendations there.
Excellent, thanks, Stephen. And as you say, I think that acceleration and just the vast quantity of data that suddenly became available was part of the challenge, right? I think, and again, when we talk productivity, I really want to come back round on that point you made there about focus and what makes the difference, you know, and unlocking that. We'll talk a bit more about that. Wendy, from your perspective, working across a number of clients, what have you seen?
So, I mean, look, everyone's been through huge amount of change in the last 18 months, particularly, whether it's, you know, managing disparate teams or looking to, you know, support and accelerate projects forward in rapid speed so that people can generate the value that they're looking for. I'm a real believer on you can't manage what you can't measure. And, you know, I think that's been something we've seen in the HR industry, certainly over the last couple of decades, around how do you drive true value and evidence that value to the board. And the more that you can actually leverage those measurements and actually demonstrate quantifiable value, to the point Steve mentioned there around what are the top three things that are driving the most change. And if we made some tweaks in these areas here, we can drive that quantifiable value from a strategic point of view, from an HR practitioner's lens. And even what Shelley mentioned around giving the managers accountability of their own recruitment process. You know, how much does that then put the power in the manager's hands and be able to support that? I think we've seen a huge change across Europe as we continue to expand. For those of you that don't know Ceridian here in the UK or in EMEA, you know, we've been on a transformation journey, you know, transforming the business from being a legacy payroll provider to really being focused on Dayforce and being solely focused on Dayforce and driving customer experience, leveraging the technology to be able to do that. And from that point, it's, for me, I think the most important thing is around giving that level of flexibility. So Shelley could use an element of the technology, but then be able to draw additional value from other areas when the time is right for Shelley and her business. Not at the time of you need to make change, therefore you have to do the whole thing in one huge program. So I think that level of flexibility and that level of partnership and support, and I know we did it in rapid fire, but I absolutely loved having our catch-up times when we would connect on a regular basis. And we did have an impending pregnancy and a successful baby delivered during that time. So that was really our stop clock, making sure that we were able to deliver a great program, support the team before the baby came along. And I was delighted to hear that everything was well there. But that's partnership. Partnership's about being in this together and actually delivering on all the things that we said we would do. And that's what we'll continue to do and continue to support not only Scott Dunn and the amazing work Shelley and her team are doing, but also all of our customers across EMEA, and we'll be leveraging Dayforce to help make that happen.
Excellent. Thanks, Wendy. And as I say, it sounds like a great partnership, and we'll hear more about that as we go forward. I'm a great believer also in the power of data in HR, but I'm also a little bit cynical about how a lot of organizations use it right now. A lot of HR for HR data, lots of information for the sake of information, or rather a lot of data for the sake of data and not enough information and insight. So turning that into tools that help the outcome of the business and the productivity of the business, that's the secret sauce. That's the thing that people want to hear about and get right. Now, Shelley, you've talked there about some of the challenges of being in the luxury travel industry during the COVID time. Clearly, lots of productivity decisions you had to make during that time. How have you lent into that data? How have you used the people data to really help the business make some productivity decisions and calls?
So I think one of the things that helped us become more productive is we took a step back, and we felt, and I think a lot of small and medium-sized businesses suffer from this, but we felt that there were disparities in our data because people weren't using a common set of definitions. And as a result of that, people would go off and create their own reports, or maybe they have their own spreadsheet to the side, or maybe it's even in their heads. And therefore, it's not accessible by the broader team, and it makes it really clunky in terms of trying to make decisions. So we took the time, and it did take time to step back and agree on a common set of definitions for the data. So we followed the mantra of go slow to go fast. Because once we had agreed on those definitions, and we let people have input into that, but once we agreed on the definitions, then the tools became much more powerful because people trusted the data. We could put it into one place, and so it was more exciting. And then, Steve, to your point about having 3 things, we focused on 5 things that we wanted to measure, like the top 5 KPIs. And so then those KPIs are what our managers are using to gauge what's happening with the business and with their teams. To the extent that they can look at those KPIs and they can see where teams are struggling, or even individuals are struggling, and then take actions to implement improvements, or maybe do some learning and development around those areas.
Excellent. And one of the questions that came up, as I thought it would, from Carolyn, just came in, Shelley, would you mind sharing those 5 KPIs, or just maybe some examples of what those are for you?
Oh gosh, they're specific to us in travel. And really what I'm talking about is our sales team, because our sales team is, they work with the guests from the time an inquiry comes in all the way through to the time our guest takes their holiday. And then on the back end as well, right? Because it's about building those relationships. So our KPIs were all about, prospecting and engaging with prospects, and the inquiries that were coming in, and conversion, and our gross profit, and those were measures that we could look at team by team, individual by individual, and we're still using those today. And in fact, it's like I said, it's not used as a stick. We have a leaderboard. It's very transparent. Everyone can see it top to bottom. We recognize people every month. It's part of our recognition that we give people. And yeah, so it's really been integrated into the business.
I think if I can pick up on that point, Shelley, because I think it's important, which is those KPIs, although you can bring them back, you should bring them back to people to understand what drives successful around that. Those KPIs themselves are actually quite specific to your type of business, right? That's the thing. They shouldn't be generic, right? They should be specific to where the value is generated in your organization, and it's just that link back then to the people data. Really interesting to understand a little bit, Steve, from yourself around, how do people link this to productivity? What have you seen?
Yeah, so I have the luxury, I guess, in my role of not just being the reporting visualization tooling guy, but I also get to do the data science side of it too, and own the concept of predicting and doing prescriptive analytics on top of that. We represent that typically in our team by talking about it in 3 ways: that we inform, we predict, and we act. So the inform is all about the reporting side of it, is making sure that folks like Shelley have the opportunity to produce the reports that they need with the data that we collect in Dayforce. Second, on the prediction side, this is where it starts to get a little more complicated, but also a little bit more exciting, because just like Shelley was talking about holding managers accountable, if I can tell you which employees are most likely to walk out the door, or which employees are most likely to be the best future leaders, and things like that, it changes the way you might take action on them. And so there's a concept of prediction that comes into play where I can not only trend what the KPIs are doing, like I might see the time to hire is trending in a certain way, but now I want to use predictive analytics to start saying where specifically, what are the drivers of that? Like, are there certain areas that I can help identify what the cause of it is? And from there say, hey, these are the optimal actions to fix that problem. And so all three of those pieces start coming into play in our game plan for what we're trying to do over the next several years. Now, we've already rolled out a few of those tools, especially flight risk is a really good one that seems to capture a lot of people's attention, especially in this day and age. It's the importance of retaining people is really upon us big time. But those tools are really interesting because what it allows you to do is not necessarily have a one size fits all program that fits an entire organization, but you can isolate it down just to the people that are at the highest risk of leaving. And what happens is every person in your company has a highest risk of something. And so as we start to put more predictors into place, it'll actually really help every manager learn this is the best action I can take at any given point on employee X. And it's really going to change the way that things are done in the HR space.
It's fascinating. And I think that predictive element gets really interesting because you're starting then to look at what could shape the business for the future using some of those and getting ahead. And rather, historically HR's reporting has been predominantly looking back, right? And this is getting us into a position of starting to look forward. Wendy, in terms of your experience around productivity, anything else that you'd like to add?
We are a hyper-growth company, right? Particularly here in EMEA. And actually, to the point that Steve raised around, for me, over the last 18 months particularly, it's been around engagement because we're a service provider. Right, so the more that we can ensure we've got the highest, I'm really pleased because we've got world-class engagement across Ceridian globally, which I'm personally proud of. So a huge shout out to the entire team that makes that happen. But we use Dayforce ourselves, so it's easy for me to be able to leverage the technology and check with an engagement process to see how engaged the teams are. Is there an area that I need to spend a bit more time just to dig a little deeper and see what we can do to improve in areas there? NPS is always measured across the entire organization. And, David Ossip, our CEO and chairman, he sees these emails that come through on a daily basis on how we're tracking from an NPS. And we are world class with our NPS delivery. And the thing for us that's fascinating around the data is that as we've seen our engagement scores soar, our NPS scores, when you track and correlate the data, they have equally measured in the same way. So it's real tangible proof that actually the more you engage with your team, that you give them a purpose, that you fully equip them and you train them and you hold them accountable for the service delivery that we provide to our wonderful customers, that actually they then feel that autonomy to make things happen. They're empowered to make things better for our customers. And, we really our culture is all about that. And how do we measure that? Through the data points and the technology. Well, that's where we can track the utilization, we can track the NPS, we can track the performance goals that we're measuring against. And we can also, demonstrate that by being able to pull those utilization reports. So the amazing and fascinating thing is that we have seen customers that when they've went live in Dayforce and as they've started, as Shelley mentioned, the more you invest, the more you get out. And that's in any technology, not just Dayforce. But, the more that we've seen our customers go live and really delve into getting to use the technology, then it's a powerful system at their fingertips, that actually their engagement, their levels of engagement are measured, and we can track that at any given time. And I think the key thing is about, in our day and age, everyone wants everything yesterday. You want to go on your phone and check your bank account. You want to download, a new app. You want to be able to stream something on Netflix. You might want to get that pizza delivery and get it 15 minutes instead of 30. Well, the more accessible you can give data to or resolve those questions for your employees, the less trouble it causes for a lot of HR operations team. And that's what we try to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And a lot of different elements there in that one discussion around productivity that I just want to have a go at quickly summarizing for those who have been listening in. So I was struck, Shelley, by your point about go slow to go fast. I love the fact that we're having a conversation with the CPO about data definitions. Very exciting. Certainly, I think a skill set that CPOs and HR as a whole need to develop over time. This is only going to get more prevalent, right? So I think that was fantastic about getting that. Think it through, get the basics right, make sure you really all know what the value is you want to deliver and how to define that, and then work forward. Work away from just informing yourselves around what's happening to predictive, to your point, Steve, and getting ahead of the curve and really using that to help you inform decision making. I love the point you make, Wendy, about the link between engagement and product and customer satisfaction. And the point around that, I guess, is around sort of experience, and we're all facing that right now, trying to create the best experience. When there's a real irony at the moment around the fact that there is a talent shortage in the market, and we're trying to find digital talent, and therefore having to grow it and protect it and keep it in our organization. So engagement and experience are really key to raising that productivity and raising customer satisfaction. I guess the other point that is worth picking up, I think, around productivity is, HR is always an organization, at least in my experience over the years, an organization that is hasn't got the volume to cover all the bases in an organization. It's always going to be volume constrained to fix things. And one of the things that always strikes me with data now, and this insight that we get from data, is the ability to target your effort as an HR function on the points that will make the most value to the organization and make the most difference, and not necessarily have to go and shotgun things across the organization, but target them. And that targeted element around productivity is quite key, I think, as we go through this as well. Thank you so much for that. There's lots of nuggets in there for those listening. There are a lot of other trends evolving. We've touched on a couple of there, but there are elements around things like AI, some of the bigger HR trends at the moment around D&I. I know you all have some perspectives and views on that. Steve, if I can start with you this time, give Shelley a rest, and maybe lead with yourself. What are the trends that you're seeing? What are the things that people need to watch out for in the future?
Yeah, well, certainly the number of laws that are coming into play worldwide that are specifically around data privacy are really impacting the ways that we have to think about how to use personally identifiable data, period. When we see these laws changing, it means that people like me have to constantly be paying attention to the law rather than really spending our time in the data, which is where we want to be. But we have to do it in an ethical way. And so the ethics that are part of data analytics of any kind are really, really critical. Like I saw there was a question that came across the Q&A that said, can data become misleading? The answer to that is absolutely, it can be. And part of our exercise, it does play right into the D&I side, because the D&I side starts to say, if we start using predictive analytics to do something, are we impacting one specific group in a bad way? And so we pay very close attention as we're building our solutions out to that specific space, because it's a very important place, an area that we have to play carefully. Along those lines, the other thing that can start to happen, because predictive analytics is so new into this HR domain, we can start creating what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if the predictive analytics say go and act on this certain group of people, we're going to start to adjust behaviors automatically. And we don't want that necessarily to happen. We're not trying to take the human out of human resources in terms of adding in AI and predictive analytics into the mix. It's meant to be something that informs. And those predictions are also meant there to inform also, so that a human being can take the most appropriate action. I've always taken a stance that we will never have all of the data about a human being, ever. Even if I did, I'd still get a lot of guesses wrong. So it's not meant to be a one shoe fits all type mentality in terms of how we do use data. But certainly one of those trends I'm seeing is that a lot of different folks out there are starting to worry about robotic HR. And I just don't see that really happening for quite a while, simply because of the data privacy laws, as well as just the use of predictive analytics. That's going to take a number of years to really start seeing that impact in the industry.
That's a good point, Steve. And part of that is also constrained by, some of this predictive element, as well as also requiring that wealth of data, right, you collect over time. And as an organization, the more data you collect over time, and that consistency, that longitudinal consistency, drives some of that, right, and helps you. And it takes time. It takes time for an organization to get to that point.
Yeah, without getting too geeky, the data for us as statisticians and data scientists is really untouched right now. So as we start touching it for the first time and discover these brand new relationships and hidden patterns, it's the first time, and that's fantastic news for everybody out there, because it works right out of the gate. As soon as we start doing that self-fulfilling prophecy concept, then it starts to change the game a little bit. That's why the concept of machine learning is so important, because the underlying data patterns actually change as new changes are made.
Excellent. And Shelley, in terms of the exciting trends, or the trends that excite you around data and analytics, where's that for you?
Well, one of the things I'm really passionate about personally is diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And that is high on our agenda as a business, as I know it is for many businesses today. We're early in our journey. We're early days. And so we know that you need the data to know where you're starting from. What's your starting point? How do you measure progress? What does progress look like? How do we even define inclusion and belonging? There are so many paths you could go down, but really what it comes down to for us is we want people to come to work and to feel that they can be themselves, right? And to feel comfortable being themselves, and that there's an environment that supports that. And, being in travel, everyone here, to a person, is really passionate about exploring new cultures, understanding different parts of the world and the differences. And so for us, diversity, it not only makes sense for our team and making sure that we foster and welcome a diverse team, but also as we think about where we send our guests and the communities the destinations we send people to. But yeah, I think there's a question when you start to look at the data and drill down into the data as you're gathering it, about data privacy and the laws by country in particular, and what can you ask of certain employees in certain countries, and how are you going to use the data? There's a whole question around trust, and will people even be willing to share their data if they don't trust what you're going to do with it, or worry that it might somehow impact their career? So I probably have more questions in this area than answers, but it's definitely something we're looking at right now.
Excellent. No, it is an exciting time, certainly, and as you say, there's so much options out there. Wendy, what are you seeing?
Well, I from a people leader perspective, I'm actually a visual girl. So, I wouldn't thank you for a dozen reports land in my inbox. I'm all about how you take the data and drive it into dashboards that I can easily see the trends and draw insights from it. And I know that a lot of other organizations, I'm not alone in that space. A lot of people will prefer to look at the patterns and the pictures and those tables, rather than actually drilling into the detail of the data that sits behind it. So, I appreciate being able to have that at a higher level and then be able to drill and drive into the details. But I think just on the trends, AIs and big data and all those are big hot topics that have been in the industry for quite a while now. But for me, I actually love the approach where it draws attention to the right area. So AI will do the mundane transactional, so it frees up time for strategy, it frees up time for great understanding of compliance, it frees up time to be able to focus on good experience and greater service. But I also think that the opportunity of the trends of utilizing data can actually invoke a conversation. So if you're seeing that there's patterns or insights that's drawing from the data that you're seeing represented in that dashboard, it can actually invoke, rather than waiting for that next one-to-one or that next performance review, it can actually invoke those conversations a little sooner. So you can get ahead of the problem before it becomes a problem. So I like the idea of, and I see a lot of organizations that I work with where we're driving more towards how do you help make that accessible and make that easy and make it meaningful. And to address one of the other questions that I saw earlier on, actually, for me, the information, you can start your data journey at any point. You don't need to be building a transformation of a new technology. That can often drive as a catalyst to look at where is our data across the world today, how do we audit our data, and how do we interpret as a business what the meaning behind each of those data elements sits and looks like. But you can do that today in any technology that you work with. And so I think that that's the conversation around how do you drive that in a meaningful way that drives that value, and then you can show the return and results on that as well.
It is, I agree that that ability to invoke a discussion through the use of data is so powerful. And whether that's which of your retail stores is outperforming the others and why, and what's the people aspects behind that. Is it to do with performance? Is it to do with the mix of the team? Is it to do with their backgrounds and so on? How does that support it? It generates a level of discussion that is different and gives the team and leadership a focal point. I certainly do believe in the power of that, as you do, Wendy. I think there's just a couple of other points just maybe to add, and I'll look to see if Steve has a perspective. But I do hear from people that the direction of travel around data, because of the complexity of the legislation, moving towards sort of individual ownership of data, carrying data passports from one business to another, and that sort of then leads you down the sort of blockchain kind of trust environments, right, and networks around data and those kind of elements. So I think there's still a long way this can go, and a lot of things that will still change around data, I think, in this environment. I don't think we've reached the zenith of it at all. I don't know, Steve, if you have a perspective on any of those things.
I'm just in general, I mean, I think the importance now of data quality is really going to start coming into play. I for years, in having worked in this space for about 10 years now, a lot of HR folks are very concerned about the quality of the data that's there. In my view, and when I've written about this quite a bit, is it only has to be good enough to be able to make a lot of progress. And so like I remember working with one company years ago that said, oh, I don't collect education data, and that's one of the elements that are in your predictive analytics, so therefore I can't use your predictive analytics. And I said, well, wait a minute, we have 50 other elements that are contributing here. So you don't have to get the data perfect in order to get it valuable. And I think people have to overcome that a little bit to make sure they understand the gains that can really be made.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. I always think when we talk the parallels between HR and finance is always very comfortable working in the realm of assumptions and sort of directional data and relative data. I think HR tends to want to become quite specific, and maybe it's because we count people as part of our jobs as well, right? And maybe that's part of what drives that, or maybe it's just that we're less assured yet around the data and the nuances of it. But certainly it's one of those things, I think, that is a difference, and we can learn from how finance treat data and use it to help directionally. I mean, it's certainly, if you're under the covers of that, it's not as accurate as you think, but it is directional, to your point, Steve. It brings us on nicely to lessons learned, which is our next point, and we want to share a little bit of that. Shelley touched on some of that around getting the basics right and go slow to go fast. But Shelley, other things HR leaders need to be aware of, or things that might trip them up as they look at data?
Yeah, well, I think this goes to the question about how do people get started on their data journey. And from my perspective, for HR to really be a strategic partner to the business, you need to start by asking the right questions. And you need to start by asking, what business challenge are we trying to solve? And then once you've identified that question, what data do you need in order to solve that challenge? So if I go back to my earlier example, when the pandemic hit, we went into survival mode. How do we survive? How do we get through this on fewer resources but yet keep our eye on the long game so that when travel bounces back, we're actually doing better, we're more efficient, we're outperforming than before we went into it. And we were going into it thinking, okay, we had a really strong year in 2019. How do we, having reduced our global workforce by 40 to 50%, how do we support that same volume of business when travel comes back? And so that was our starting point. And then the data and the modeling I talked about fed into that.
Thanks, Shirley, very helpful.
Say, Aaron, I will say, it's not as if the operational HR reporting, the more transactional side of things, not that doesn't matter, because that's kind of like the bread and butter that you have to, you still need to report on that anyway. But I do think there's an opportunity for HR to play a more strategic role.
Certainly, and I think this point about don't create data for the sake of creating data, focus on what makes an impact for the outcome of the business, start there, can really inform how much effort you put in and where you put that effort into collecting data. You also made this point around the definitions and agreeing those up front. I think it's really key, but one of the things that I've always been struck with is also just trying to embed a mindset of accountability for data into your organization, so that everyone who is touching that people data, whether it's in HR or as someone in a service center or someone as a business partner or the line manager, understands the implication for the business of getting that right and how important it is, and takes a level of accountability for keeping it right. I think that is, a lot of people miss that element and they focus on just getting the integrity of the data right and not changing the mindset. Okay, with you, Shelley.
I'll just, I just want to, on that note, Aaron, I would say one of the things we learned about Dayforce is that previously, back when Dayforce had the bad reputation, people didn't know the knock-on effect for the data that was being input or what they were doing, and just weren't really thinking about what happens down the line if you don't get it right up front. And that's something that came out of this as well, and that was a lesson learned.
Yeah, excellent. It is that visibility, as you say, of the knock-on effect. Excuse me. And Steve, I know you have some thoughts on where people should think. One of the questions that's also come up, if I can ask you to think about as well, is that the point you were making earlier about some of the sort of data collection elements, the data council, the working with the works councils, etc., in places like Germany that are very strong on their data protection. How does that all impact, and what do people need to think about? So if you could share your thoughts and maybe give some thoughts on that as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of whether we're talking about workers' councils or unions or not, that there's a general fear over how data is being used or could be used. In my view, it's all about making it beneficial to the employees. If the output that comes out of it is something that is benefiting the employees, they will be much more receptive to letting the data be used for different things. We're not rejecting people. We're not, the goal of this is not to say, hey, we're going to prevent you from getting something. We're trying to say, no, all of this is towards investing in you. How they will respond to that is still a little up in the air. I mean, we get different types of reactions and depending on the audiences that we talk to. I talk about predictive analytics a lot, and since we're on the topic of kind of measure creation, Shelley, a lot of what we've dealt with in this HR space over the last few years too is related to how do you create measures for the squishy stuff? Like how do you measure things like culture? And NPS scores are used for engagement, but if I asked every person who's attending this call what engagement is, I'll get 100 different answers, right? Like it's very difficult to try to get to that commonality and that importance of having that data lineage that takes you all the way back to here's how we're calculating it, and letting people see what that calculation is really going to be critical to making whether it be that we're serving a union or serving a non-union, it definitely comes into play to make sure that you get the data right.
Steve, I agree with that. And I think that HR leaders can use leading indicators to define things like culture and to define things like engagement. And it might be something as simple as how many people are being promoted internally versus, people that you're bringing into the organization from outside. And so there's a whole set of things, and it's probably contextual depending on your company, right? What that set of leading indicators is, but that is something that's indicative of how your culture is doing and the engagement levels.
Excellent. Thank you. And Wendy, your thoughts on lessons that people can learn, where to pitfalls to avoid?
Problem statements, understanding, right from the very, I think we've said as a common theme throughout the discussion so far, what is it we're trying to answer? And then how are we going to interpret the data? I think those are the areas, because it's the same old, I've been in payroll most of my career. If you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. And so the whole purpose of really driving self-service was to get great data. You put it in the hand of the person, it's their bank account, it's their address details, it's their information, that you have the best quality of data. I think the only thing I would add to the conversation is I think it's really important and critical to have that accountability and ownership, especially when you're a global organization. But I also think that there's an aspect of governance. So as things change, or as things need to change as your business evolves, that those parameters and checks are in place before change happens. And I think sometimes businesses are moving at such a fast pace, M&A activity, opening up a new office in a new country, what information do I need to do that in a compliant way? And sometimes as you're building and you're scaling, that governance and the continuous build and growth of the business sometimes gets missed. So it's always, looking at those things, and if you have those processes and audit in place, and that's owned, whether it's by HR or by HRIT or internal audit, then you're in a good place.
No, certainly, I think that's a good point, Wendy. And I think the other just another thought for those listening in on sort of where things can go awry, and it harks back, I think, Shelley, to your point about definitions. One of my favorite passions, I have to say, as people here on this call will know. It's basically, if you're in a global organization, how making sure that each of the parts of your organization and each country understands what you mean by a particular data point, because the goal here is to look at your organization as a whole, to understand that data as a whole. And if everybody has defined FTE slightly differently, or they've defined workplace slightly differently, or they've gone to a different level of granularity on capability, so they've all filled capability in, but all filled it to a different level of granularity or a different structure, you can't then raise that up, right? And it sounds common sense, but so many times that is the issue with reporting when we go into look at organizations, that those definitions have not been followed through, that the understanding is not consistent at the right level of detail to allow then the reporting to and the full power of the reporting to be realized. So certainly one thing to look out for, I think, in that mix. We are entering that stage of the call where we're going to look at some of the rest of the Q&A that's coming in. We've had a good opportunity, I think, throughout to answer a lot of the questions that have come up. Thank you for those of you who have raised them. We have a bit of a long one currently in the chat, and I'm looking at Steve at the moment as we look at that. It might be a bit unfair, Steve, but I'm going to ask you to have a go first, if you don't mind, around sort of the downside of predictive. I know it's one of your passions, but clearly there are some downsides around predictive and how it can be misused. So I'd love to get your perspective, and then maybe Shelley's view as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, and this is a really hot topic, right? I think it's why there's so many data privacy laws going into play and AI governance, rules. The thing that I like to consider here is I don't expect every HR leader to be a data scientist. I don't expect you to understand the methodology that I might be using to create the prediction, which ultimately kind of, well, what it does is it shows you what the drivers are. Why is something happening? Or why is a person a high flight risk employee, for instance? The question becomes, and this is where I do agree with the comment about how ethics come into play here, is you have to take the actions that are going to have the positive impact, not the negative impact. So if you see someone who's a high flight risk, obviously a manager is going to have a choice at that point. They're going to have to say, do I want to take a positive action or a negative action? And because any HCM system may or may not record what the action is, sometimes no action is a really good choice to take. And what I want to do throughout our product and to make it more intelligent is to start to make it more difficult to make those bad decisions. It's not an easy thing to do because there is the human aspect of it. I would challenge the writer of the question a little bit to say, what would happen if you didn't have a prediction? Would you still take the same kind of negative actions? I do agree that the predictions can start to do that self-fulfilling prophecy. That is possible, and that those are the things that we want to try to avoid. But I can share a lot of different examples of where managers are asked to deem who is a high flight risk, and they're terrible at predicting it, to be quite honest. The measurements that we've done and evaluated, it's unfortunate, but people aren't great at that. And so when you start to partner the things up, if you say, look, here's what I know from the data that I have of who the high flight risks are, and then you combine that with the intelligence of the person. Because keep in mind, what we're doing when we're building flight risk predictions is doing it based off of the data that's collected in Dayforce. I don't know what else is going on in the person's life. And a lot of times the reason why a person leaves an organization has nothing to do with the HR side, but often it does. Often it has to do with the relationship with the manager, for instance. And if that's the case, the same things that you're worried about are going to happen regardless of whether there's a prediction or not. So it's more about paying attention and monitoring the actions that are actually taken. And the more that we can capture what those actions are, it'll really help to prevent some of the bad stuff from happening.
Oh, you're on mute, Aaron, but I think
it was bound to happen. Now we're equal. Chris will get me back for that later. Shelley, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I think, Steve, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Flight risk predictions, if you're only using those data points to make a decision, then yes, I agree, it's dangerous. But it comes down to the relationship between the manager and the employee and what kind of conversations are being had and what's the quality of those conversations. And do the managers have the tools and the skills to have effective conversations to understand why somebody might be thinking about leaving? So to me, data plays an important role, but it's not the only factor that should be taken into consideration.
Just to add one thing to that, Shelley, because one of the studies that we have done with different companies in the past, as those actions start coming into play, and sometimes the actions are very small things. It's recognize a person, meet with a senior leader, and just to get their perspectives. One of the things that we saw that was amazing when we started down this path of treating high flight risk people was that the managers themselves started to apply those same actions across all of their employees. And then those employees started to use those same kind of methods and methodologies to apply those actions against other co-employees. And it was absolutely fascinating watching how that changed. It actually started having this causational effect on engagement, which we weren't expecting when we started down that journey. We were thinking, oh, we're going to go save people from leaving. But no, it actually had a very correlational and causational effect on several other important HR KPIs, which I thought was fascinating.
Excellent. No, thank you, Steve. That's a great add. And it's always good to have a discussion on data and reporting that has the word causational in it. Love that. Thank you so much. Wouldn't be complete without it, I have to say. I think we're reaching the top of the time now, so we're going to just wrap up a little bit. So many topics to cover, and we said it'd be tough to get it in the hour. Undoubtedly, there'll be more questions that people will have. This has been recorded. We'll be publishing it out so that people can re-listen to it over time. Certainly, I know the panelists would be very happy to receive questions after time if people have them. But we've covered a lot, right? We've covered how important HR data now is in a post-COVID environment. We started to touch on that. There's a whole aspect around well-being and data around well-being we haven't even got to today. So maybe a topic for another one. We've talked about how to use that data and the power HR has to use that data to help the productivity of the business. We talked about the importance of outcomes and really understanding those. We talked about some of the big trends that are coming and things that people need to think about. Predictive clearly has been a big discussion, but also the care that needs to be taken around that when you're using it in your organization and the sensibility around it. But also some real practical lessons learned there from everybody. And thank you, Shelley, for sharing those as you've gone through that journey. in your organization. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Steve, for your time as well. Really appreciate your insights, and Wendy for sharing with us the experience of Dayforce and how that has changed as an organization over the last couple of years, and how you've used that yourselves to drive your own organization and use data as well. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully we'll have another one at some point in the near future, because I've certainly enjoyed it. I'd love to do it again and keep going. But we have to draw it to a close. Thank you to everybody who joined in today. Thank you for your questions. It always helps keep it interactive. And have a great week, everybody. We're going to leave you at that point. As I say, the recording will be available. Thank you, everyone.